You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I can't believe we've reached the point already where somehow the Mitch Trubisky hype is out of control. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. You can join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Hopefully you listen first every day. And on the show today, unfortunately, somehow, some way, for some reason, we have to go through the Mitch Trubisky conversation. We have to sort of put a reality check in here, maybe just for other teams, if not anything, even if nothing else, because somehow, some way, he's getting hyped up as a prize is maybe a strong word, but as a top legitimate, like, free agent quarterback option for a lot of these quarterback needy teams, to the point where they might compete for Mitch Trubisky and spend a lot of money on Mitch Trubisky. Like, the demand is all of a sudden high, and we'll kind of go through what that demand looks like, why that demand might be there. We'll have to touch base again on sort of reality checking that with what we saw from him in 4 seasons in Chicago, and just kind of what his quarterback market could look like versus the other options out there versus the other teams that have openings, because there always seems to be a little bit of a greater need and a little greater demand than there is supply. Well, let's start specifically with the Mitch Trubisky hype, which sounds weird to even say at this point. And like, when it first started happening, it almost felt like a joke, right? It was like for a lot of this offseason before we got to this point, I would like specifically heckle other hosts on the Locked On Podcast Network of teams that needed quarterbacks. Like when Drew Brees retired from the Saints, I told Ross Jackson, "Hey, you excited for Mitch Trubisky to be your quarterback next year?" And it was always a joke, right? It was always like, "Oh man, no, come on, like we're gonna do better than that." Or like, you look around, like Ben Roethlisberger retires from the Steelers. It's like, "Hey, get ready for Mitch Trubisky," and all of a sudden, like, it's like, get ready for Mitch Trubisky in a good way. Like, teams want to have Mitch Trubisky as like their plan at quarterback. It really took off at the NFL scouting combine, right? You talk to people that were down there in Indianapolis, and that's really what the buzz was about Mitch Trubisky as an upcoming free agent that a lot of teams seem to be interested in, more so than the quarterbacks performing at the combine, more so than even some of the trade rumors that were being floated around, in some part because, there wasn't like a wide range of teams in on, say, like Russell Wilson, for example. But still, Mitch Trubisky, we're talking about that Mitch Trubisky. I mean, I guess I understand that, yes, he is the former number 2 overall pick. He was drafted that high for a reason, but he was also a large point of ridicule for the Chicago Bears for having drafted him that high. And it feels like one of those, like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have it both ways, where like the Bears are made fun of for drafting him and him being a quote unquote bust, but then also like he's an interesting free agent because he was drafted so high. But wait, isn't the high drafting part of the criticism there? It's like, it seems like it's a combination of, number 2 overall pick, still 27 years old, turns 28 before the start of next season. But this idea that maybe he's still sort of young and undeveloped, like, is there supposed to be untapped potential there that we didn't see in 4 years really 3.5 full years as a starter in Chicago? I guess the other thing you see quite a bit is the QB wins, right? I mean, as a starter, he was 29 and 21 in Chicago, and that's a pretty darn good winning percentage compared to a lot of other quarterbacks that become available on the free agent market like this. And then, of course, there's also, I think, this sort of feeling that, like, well, we've seen now for sure that Matt Nagy was a problem in Chicago. So therefore, maybe in their eyes, perhaps, maybe there's a feeling that Trubisky could be more because Nagy wasn't the right guy, and that maybe a different coach could get more out of him. And maybe that's true. Maybe a different coach could get more out of Mitch Trubisky. But are we going to pretend that like he's all of a sudden going to become a great quarterback all of a sudden? Like, do we ignore the 4 years? Like, how are we able to put that behind us, right? I think where a lot of this comes from, certainly I would guess Trubisky's agent has been effective in marketing his quarterback and putting some of that out there. And then also there's such a strong connection between him and the New York Giants right now. That's really the team that's been most heavily reported to be thought to be expected to be interested in Trubisky, right? The ways that they report tampering without actually saying it's tampering. The Giants aren't allowed to talk to Mitch Trubisky yet, but like everybody and their mom sees the Giants as the team that's very interested in signing Mitch Trubisky, even though legally by the rules, there's not supposed to have been any sort of work there. But of course, the Giants hired the Bills offensive coordinator, Brian Daboll, as their head coach. I believe their general manager came from the Bills front office. Their quarterback's coach came from the Bills coaching staff. So of course, like he was coached by Daboll in Buffalo for that year. Daboll might want to bring him to New York to compete with Daniel Jones. That's the thinking. And I think once you sort of have one team seen as this sort of clear buyer, then all of a sudden it's like, well, all the other teams should be interested then too, right? And that's where the hype builds up. Well, if the Giants are interested, then also you should mark him to the Steelers and the Panthers and the Colts or whoever, whatever teams you want to throw out there for Mitch Trubisky. And all of a sudden you can build this hype of like all of a sudden like a free agent market for him that, I mean, given the buzz at the combine, it sounds like it's legitimately there for him, but it also sounds like it's legitimately getting out of control a little bit when we hear like the word almost like sweepstakes, the Mitch Trubisky sweepstakes. Like there could be a bidding war for him, you know what I mean? Like competition to sign Mitch Trubisky. Not that Mitch Trubisky is the worst quarterback in the world, and he may well be better than some of the other free agent quarterback options. We're not going to completely take everything away from him, but I think it is important that we kind of check in on what Trubisky is and isn't as a quarterback at this stage of his career. Next on Locked On Bears, you can be sure we'll get odds on Mitch Trubisky's next team from our friends at BetOnline, the number one place for all of your sports betting needs and info with the latest odds, contests, and player props throughout free agency and the NFL draft. But now it's that time of year again with college basketball's tournament upon us as well. BetOnline.net is going to be your source for all of the madness all month long. And it's not just football and basketball. BetOnline.net has all your sports wagering informations and needs with live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about all the top trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. The conversation about Mitch Trubisky as a free agent and a quarterback for his next team has to start with what we actually saw from him in Chicago, because it feels like we're sort of they're sort of glossing over the bad in Chicago and just kind of looking at the good and the potential there and sort of the unknown and the mystery there, right? Of course, he made the Pro Bowl in 2018. He did lead the Bears to the playoffs of sorts, win 11-3 as the starter of that season. The team finished 12-4 with the 2 games that he missed that season. 24 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. So he's had a pretty good ratio in his career, 64 to 38 touchdown to interception ratio. And then, of course, apparently a year off in Buffalo is enough to just totally clean up that reputation as a quarterback. And again, this is not, I don't want to sit here and just like crap on Mitch Trubisky for 25 minutes, but let's be realistic about what he was in Chicago, right? Rookie season, a little too hard to take much out of that. Glennon starts the first 4 games. Trubisky gets thrown in there and has some flashes. I remember that first, was it his first game or his second game? He played the Ravens and the Vikings in there early on. And in both games, I remember him showing some pretty bright flashes that we were like, okay, there's mistakes here. There's some rawness here. He's a developmental guy, but there's some playmaking ability. Of course, the mobility, a big part of that. So then comes into year 2, they get Allen Robinson in the door. They build up this defense to be something, rivaling some of the better Bears defenses of our lifetimes. And they go 12-4 and they get a bunch of turnovers and they're able to piece together overall a pretty solid offense. It wasn't, lighting the world on fire, but they were 10th in scoring and 21st in yards. But of course, number one defense generating a lot of turnovers really helped the offense quite a bit. But you get, the big game against Tampa Bay where he throws for 6 or 7 touchdowns, whatever it was in that one, where he just sliced up their whole defense. They go on a 5-game winning streak, and then they totally win like 9 out of their last 10, ending the season and ride high into the playoffs, lose to the Eagles. And really, it's important to kind of remember that there were some really strong showings in there, particularly when he lit up the Detroit Lions. And of course, we mentioned the Pittsburgh or the Tampa Bay Buccaneers game, but then there were some rough moments in there too. The game against the Vikings was kind of turnover heavy earlier in the season. The game against the Rams after the loss to the Giants was a really tough one against a tough defense. And then against the Eagles in that wild card game, Trubisky was bad for 3.5 quarters. Led him on a touchdown scoring drive in the fourth quarter, and then set up the potential game-winning field goal. He came in clutch at the end. Awful for a lot of bad interceptions that were not dropped. He was inaccurate and just struggled throughout a lot of that game. And it felt like from 2018 on, the rest of the NFL really started catching up more to Mitch Trubisky, right? It seemed like the skill set wasn't able to adapt to the way defenses would cover him, right? We kind of saw 2019 in particular, when there were some bumps along the road and they lost 4 games in a row there, including starting in Vegas or in London with the Raiders. And we saw him bounce back against the Lions against a bad Matt Patricia defense that was very man coverage heavy. And then later in the season when he had a really good game against the Cowboys and it was the Lions again. And then the Cowboys right after that, back to back, put up some scores in that game. I remember again, it was kind of when teams would kind of go really easy to predict man coverage, Trubisky was a sort of a see it, throw it quarterback. And if you didn't disguise the coverage or hide very much, he would be able to fire the ball downfield. He has an arm, he has the mobility, and he had, Allen Robinson and some receiver talent, and at least some receiver talent to be able to work the ball downfield. Plus, David Montgomery in the backfield at that point, and still a very good defense. Tariq Cohen was a part of that year as well. So there was enough there where if the defense wasn't trying to hide things and just kind of went a little bit too simple, Trubisky could do some damage. Absolutely. And that was what kept a lot of the hope alive, was that, okay, going into that offseason, right, needed to become, what was Matt Nagy's phrase, a master of coverages, I think was the thing that he said Trubisky needs to work on. Because, there were a couple of those interceptions where he just you could tell he just didn't see a defender there and threw it to where he thought his receiver was going to go. And there was a defender right there that picked it off. And I don't remember if it ended up being a pick six, but there was one in particular that was going across. It was a drag route across the field over to the right side. It was a cover 2. Cornerback was just sitting there waiting for it. And it was or the linebacker, and Trubisky just never saw him there as he was going through his progression. And that was always sort of where you kept hitting that wall with Trubisky, is that next level processing. He would try and be a hero. He would try and make plays and extend plays and create something and make something magical happen, and not just, and wouldn't fully have that cerebral, quarterback knowledge base and truly understand in depth and out, reading the coverage, knowing where players are going to be, and not just sort of seeing the field live and reacting to it as it comes, but being able to anticipate a little bit more and lead receivers. And that's why, you ultimately end up going to Nick Foles after a 3-1 start. And then the offensive line struggled. And of course, once they switched and tailored the offense 2 seasons ago now, and had Bill Lazor take over the play calling and go to more of that West Coast style rollout offense, all of a sudden things started working again with Trubisky. Now, as we kind of talked about at the time, it was against the Texans, the Vikings, and the Jaguars for those 3 wins. It was not necessarily high quality playoff contending opponents there, but still, that I think is what, if I'm another team hoping for Trubisky, that's what I'm holding on to, right? Is that, okay, when the Bears worked out some scheme things to simplify the reads, make the plays easier for Trubisky, and use his legs a little bit more, actually adapting the scheme to the player as opposed to trying to fit the player into the scheme, something was starting to work a little bit better there. Now, are those 3 games enough for me to invest in Mitch Trubisky as my go-to starting quarterback? No. And I think the fact that the Bears were there for that and were there for all 4 seasons and said, no, this isn't going to work, really, I think speaks volumes, right? That Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace kept their jobs. It wasn't like a new regime came in at that time and said, sorry, Trubisky, you're the old regime. But like this was Ryan Pace's pick at quarterback. It was not Matt Nagy's pick at quarterback, but it was the quarterback Matt Nagy was specifically brought in to fix, rebuild, work with, develop, and grow. And when he says, you know what, we just can't do this. We're going to go a different direction. All of a sudden, that should be a pretty strong evidence, even though we don't fully trust Nagy and Pace's ability to properly develop these players. It still says something that they were the ones that gave up on him. And so it really doesn't match, what we've seen on the field from Trubisky with what the hype and anticipation is for him right now. But we'll look at how the different market dynamics of the quarterback market play into this, and yet still we're talking as much as 10 million plus per year for Mitch Trubisky. That and more coming up next on Locked On. The buzz about Mitch Trubisky coming out of the combine was legitimately like looking at $10+ million a year in a contract for Mitch Trubisky. And who knows, maybe that could still end up being a 1-year prove it type contract, but still $10 million is pretty good for a guy who was seemingly not all that wanted last season, right? I mean, last offseason, as he went through free agency, he got a 1-year, $2.5 million contract with the Buffalo Bills. He spent the whole season on the bench for the Bills. I think he appeared in like a game. No, okay, so he technically registered 6 appearances, but most importantly, attempted 8 passes, went 6 of 8 with an interception in there, I should mention. So he attempts 8 passes, and all of a sudden his value in the free agent market has gone up 4 times, literally, and from $2.5 million to potentially $10 million. And all that's happened is he threw 8 passes as a member of the Buffalo Bills. Right? That doesn't quite add up, especially when you look at this free agent quarterback class. You can look at it and say, well, Trubisky's value is high because look at the other quarterback options that are available. It's if you're a team that needs a quarterback and you're looking at free agency, you've got Andy Dalton, Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota, Teddy Bridgewater, Tyrod Taylor, Jacoby Brissett, and Cam Newton. Right? Those are sort of like your top 7 or 8 other guys. And you can say, well, okay, comparatively to those guys, I think you'd take Trubisky's potential and his mobility over Andy Dalton. I think you'd probably take it over Cam Newton at this stage of his career. Jacoby Brissett's been kind of unimpressive backup, maybe Tyrod too. Even you can start to have a different conversation. It becomes tighter with Winston and Mariota and maybe Bridgewater in there. But you can say, okay, when you start stacking them up, Trubisky's probably a fairly enticing option comparatively. Sure. But also, last offseason, all of those guys were free agents except, I think, Mariota. But last year, Dalton was a free agent. Winston was a free agent. Bridgewater was a free agent, I think. But Tyrod was, Brissett was, and Newton was. Like, every team had almost that exact same selection of quarterbacks last offseason. Add in Ryan Fitzpatrick was a free agent then too, who's retired. And technically, I think Big Ben's contract was renewed then too. But anyway, it's almost exactly the same free agent quarterback class also, right? It's not like this year has a significantly worse crop, where last year Trubisky was buried under other really good quarterbacks that became available. No, it's almost virtually the same group of quarterbacks that all signed 1-year deals last season. Plus you add in Mariota, and I think maybe I can't remember what happened with Bridgewater's last contract. So it's not as though the supply changed at all from last year, and yet Trubisky's still worth 4 times as much, supposedly. And even you think about the quarterback trade market, right? Last year we had Matthew Stafford traded to the Rams, and then Carson Wentz traded, and now we've got Russell Wilson traded and Carson Wentz traded again, right? So it's not like there hasn't been it was 2 years ago when the Bears first brought in Nick Foles that had the major quarterback moving with Tom Brady going across the board and him being available in free agency. And I mean, Phillip Rivers changed teams. That was a year when it would have made sense that every team gets their quarterback and Trubisky slips through and signs for $2.5 million. But last year, teams had openings and there weren't a lot of great quarterbacks available in free agency, and they still said no. And he went to Buffalo for $2.5 million. Throws 8 passes and now is worth $10 million. It doesn't really fully make sense to me. I mean, the main thing I'm left is just that there are teams that need quarterbacks, and there's just not enough quarterbacks available. Because like you can throw in like maybe Deshaun Watson becomes available if his sexual assault case somehow clears up soon. Jimmy Garoppolo is expected to be traded to somebody. Kirk Cousins maybe will be traded from the Vikings, maybe not. Matt Ryan maybe traded from the Falcons, maybe not. But like you have, I think I count eight or so teams that could all use new quarterbacks or quarterbacks brought in. Steelers to replace Ben Roethlisberger. Carolina Panthers need anything. Colts to replace Carson Wentz. Seahawks to potentially replace Russell Wilson and compete with Drew Lock. Tampa Bay's got to replace Tom Brady. The Saints might re-sign Jameis Winston, but still need a quarterback there. The Giants looking to compete somebody with Daniel Jones. And then if the Vikings trade Cousins, they'll need a quarterback. If the Texans trade Watson, or even if they don't, because depending on what happens, I mean, Watson's just not available. They will probably also need a quarterback. So that's, if you include all nine, that would be all nine of those teams. If you trade Cousins, it would probably remove one of those teams. If you trade Jimmy Graham, that would take one of those teams out of there too. So like, but still, we're talking 7 to 9 teams that need a quarterback. And again, your options are Trubisky, Dalton, Winston, Mariota, Bridgewater, Tyrod Taylor. Like, it's not a great crop. And there is, again, demand is outpacing quality of supply right now. So like from that sense, from that perspective, it makes sense, but it still doesn't. Like, plenty of teams needed quarterbacks last offseason, and like Washington Commanders now opted for Carson Wentz. You know what I mean? Like, rather than trying to get into that Trubisky sweepstakes that's apparently coming. So I just feel like we need to slow this down, and I wonder how much of it is, again, agent buzz stirring up, getting some good media attention, doing interviews. Mitch does an interview with Adam Schefter's podcast. All of a sudden, some maybe carefully planted insider news tips about Trubisky going to some different people, sort of building this hype artificially. And maybe that $10 million number never comes to fruition, or maybe he goes straight to the Giants and no one else is, or other teams aren't as interested as maybe we were led to believe they might be. But it just seems a little bit ridiculous. Nothing against Mitch Trubisky, the person. I'm sure he's a great guy. He has a baby on the way. He's happily married, I think, now, and I wish him all of the career success he can have. Right, it's not against him. It's just like let's make some football X's and O's sense here of something that seems to be just a little bit out of control, and let's try and tone it back down just a little bit more here from a quarterback that all of us know plenty more about than a lot of these other teams. Well, not a lot of these other fan bases that might be getting into the Mitch Trubisky train, right? The Mitch Trubisky roller coaster, the ups and downs and the fun. And like I said, I would love nothing more than to see him go to the Giants, win the starting job, and sort of rebuild his career and make a bunch of money and have success. That would be great. Be so happy for Mitch Trubisky, absolutely. But it just doesn't seem like the evidence is there to support it, even though the messaging has seemed to be sort of contrasting that. It'll be fun to see where he goes and what else unfolds in this quarterback market. I have a feeling, given Jimmy Garoppolo and Kirk Cousins situations, and maybe Watson too, that there's more dominoes to fall here, and we'll see how that affects what's available there for Mitch Trubisky. And then the ripple effect on the rest of the market as teams spend their quarterback money, they have less money to spend elsewhere, and maybe that frees up more for the Chicago Bears to go sign the right wide receiver or cornerback, offensive line, whatever it might be. You can be sure we'll break it all down for you all throughout the offseason right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. If you're looking for that second listen, the Locked On NFL podcast is keeping you up to date on all these big moves. We're on back-to-back days with big trades. More should be in the works. And the Locked On NFL podcast covers it from the league-wide perspective, plus taking in our local hosts for their perspectives on their individual teams. It's a great way to get your NFL coverage when you're done with Locked On Bears, because Locked On Bears podcast is your team every day here in the Locked On Bears, or the Locked On Podcast Network. And I hope that Locked On Bears makes it that much easier for you to bear down.